We're good to go now. So hello, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar organized by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. This is another webinar within a series of high-level dialogues UNIDO has held with its partners on the relevance of quality and standards in the fight against COVID-19. Today's event will focus on trade, quality and safety of health products in the times of the global pandemic, and we will discuss the lessons so far. The renowned panelists will reflect on the experiences so far, how the global pandemic has disrupted trade, quality, and also highlight the importance of conformity assessment. We have 5 panelists today, and about 300 attendees have registered to follow the session. Thank you everybody for being here with us today. The session will start with some introductory remarks, followed by a panel discussion and question and answers from the audience. Attendees are encouraged to put their questions in writing in the Q&A box at the bottom of their Zoom window. Selected questions from the audience will be asked to the panelists. Due to time limitations, we might not be able to answer all the questions that we receive. We will do our best to pick up the most relevant questions and pose them to the panelists. We would like to apologize in advance if we will not manage to answer all the questions. Today, we will also take full advantage of the technology. The session will be recorded and the recordings will be made available to the audience thereafter. For any further information on this webinar or any other webinars, please go to the TII Knowledge Hub, tii.unido.org. And having said that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Juan Pablo Davila. Juan Pablo Davila is an Industrial Development Officer at UNIDO's Division of Quality Infrastructure and Smart Production within the Department of Digitalization, Technology and Innovation. He's managing a number of technical cooperation projects worldwide, such as in Peru, in South Africa, or in Ghana. We are very pleased that he will be moderating today's session. Juan Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dorina. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I would like to start off by welcoming everyone, our distinguished panelists and audience. Thank you for joining us. We are honored that many of you are watching this discussion today. And as mentioned, we have more than 300 registered people from different countries. We will see if we can know the origin of the representatives that are joining, and I will let you know in a minute. We know that people from the Americas, Europe, Asia have registered. So good morning for those connecting in the Americas, good afternoon for those in Europe and Africa, and good evening for those in Asia. As mentioned, I am part of the UNIDO Quality Infrastructure and Smart Production division. And among other functions, we specialize in providing technical assistance to build and strengthen national and regional quality infrastructure systems to provide internationally recognized services. We support as well SMEs to take advantage of new technologies and standards for smart production to facilitate trade and thus participate in global value chains. We have now about 150 participants, and I think that's a very good turnout. In other circumstances, I mean, in the previous normal, if we were in a venue and meeting physically, I will be telling you that in the event of an emergency or fire and alarm, to please proceed quickly and come into the nearest emergency exit. Fortunately, or unfortunately, this does not apply here today. However, in case you are disconnected from the webinar, please reconnect using the same link that was sent to you. I hope that you are all safe and well from wherever you are connecting. Now let me get into the matter subject. As is widely known, the COVID-19 pandemic has put us in an unprecedented situation and confronted us with new challenges. It has exposed the sensitivity and importance of certain value chains, like the PPEs to medical devices and pharmaceuticals. The resilience of these global value chains against external disruptions require flexibility to interchange, increase and trust suppliers, ensure outputs and inputs when needed without compromising the quality, safety, suitability, stability, and reliability of the products. This is where a wider acceptance of standards and regulations and conformity assessment processes and procedures play an important role in building trust between actors. Therefore, in light of this, the purpose of the discussions today is to reflect on the experiences so far and how the global COVID-19 pandemic has introduced disruptions in trade and quality, and highlight the importance of regulatory cooperation, international standards, and conformity assessment in mitigating the harmful effects of the crisis. A group of distinguished experts will present these issues from their own perspective, from international trade, national public sector view, the private sector reaction, policy specialists, and development agencies, all converging to see if we can draw some lessons learned so far. We are using this technology, but of course you that are watching may know who we are, but we would like also to know who is on the other end of the webinar. So I will not ask you to present yourselves, but I will kindly ask you to fill out a poll that you should see now in your screens. I will give a few seconds. We want to know which stakeholder group best describes you. If you come from a government, a regulatory, from the private sector, from an international organization, or from a quality infrastructure institution. Please fill out the form. And as we are getting the votes, we want to know exactly the profile of the audience. I think now we are sharing the results. We have a good mix from government, regulatory, private sector, international organizations, and quality infrastructure. I think it's a very good mix for the different topics that we will be presenting. Thank you very much for filling the poll. It has given us a lot of information on the audience. On that note, I will now briefly introduce our distinguished speakers in the order of which they will be speaking. Today, we are very honored and glad to welcome Mr. Ai-Ho Lim. He is the Director of the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO, where he oversees work on trade and environment, as well as on the Agreement of Technical Barriers to Trade, the TBT agreement. Mr. Lim has extensive experience in trade policy and negotiations, trade and sustainable development and services. Welcome, Mr. Lim. Thank you for joining us today. Mr. Lim is joining us from Geneva, Switzerland. Our next distinguished panelist is Mr. Augusto Gaia. He is the Deputy General Manager of the Medical Devices Office of the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa. Mr. Gaia has a pharmaceutical degree and has specialized as pharmacist clinical pathologist. And at Anvisa, he has previously worked as a specialist in regulation and health surveillance, working in the process of product registration and certification of good manufacturing practices. Welcome, Mr. Gaia, and he's joining us from Brasilia, Brazil. The next presenter is Celine Kaufman, is one of his team experts joining us. She is Deputy Head of the Regulatory Policy Division in the OECD Public Governance and Territorial Development Directorate, where she leads the work on international regulatory cooperation, on the regulatory policy outlook, and on regulation and emerging technologies. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Kaufman. She's joining us from Paris, France. Our next distinguished panelist, Mr. Anupan Kaul. He heads and leads the standards, quality management, laboratory management, risk management, and quality and governance initiatives of the CII Institute of Quality. The CII is the Confederation of Indian Industries. In a career spanning 40 years with extensive exposure to industrial quality control, standards development, conformity assessment, accreditation, both at national and international levels. He is recognized as a subject expert and works closely with government, in determining policy measures on positioning standards and conformity assessment as a driver for economic growth. Welcome, Mr. Kaul. It is a pleasure to have you here. Mr. Kaul is joining us from New Delhi, India. Our last but not least distinguished panelist is Dr. Bernardo Calzadilla Sarmiento. He is the Managing Director of the Directorate of Digitalization, Technology, and Agribusiness here at UNIDO. Just previously, he was Director of the Department of Trade, Investment, and Innovation. Apart from his work at UNIDO, Dr. Calzadilla was also Director for the Technical Assistance and Training Services at ISO, as well as the Secretary of ISO Policy Committee on Developing Country Matters, ISO-DEVCO. He has more than 25 years of international experience as a senior quality and standards expert. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Calzadilla, and he's joining us from Vienna, Austria. Once again, I would like to thank the audience for joining us. There are participants from all over the world who are listening today. And we, as mentioned at the beginning, we encourage you to be involved and be part of the discussion. Before starting, we would like to pose a question, another poll on Nora, can you post to see there's no right or wrong answer. We want to explore what do you think is the most important factor in facilitating access to PPEs, medical equipment, and pharmaceutical. We will give some seconds before we go to the presentation of Ho Lin from the WTO. As mentioned, it's not a right or wrong answer, and we will see how these answers vary at the end of the discussion. I think we can have share the results. Can we share the results of the, there you can see the share results. It is a more towards international standards, conformity assessment, regulatory cooperation acceptance. I think this gives us a very good overview of the feeling, well, not the feeling, the perception of our audience. Now, without any further comments, I will introduce Mr. Ho and for the presentation from the WTO. Mr. Ho, is over to you. Thank you. I think you are muted.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and my thanks very much to UNIDO for organizing this webinar on this really very important issue. Now, as you have said, the COVID-19 pandemic has focused attention, very much on guaranteeing access to medicines, personal protection equipment, medical devices, and so forth. And as we all know, since these goods are traded internationally, ensuring their continued flow is of course of central importance to ensuring that people have the supplies that they need. So for my presentation, I just want to focus on a few of the trade-related factors that matter when we think about ensuring that supply. In your poll, you've already covered actually quite the key ones. So let me just focus on two to start with. Firstly, tariffs. As you said, tariffs have a bearing on the flow of these products. And we did some analysis, or our statisticians did some analysis, I should say. And I think the results are actually quite surprising. For example, the average applied tariff for hand soap is 17%. Now, and if you think about it, that's pretty high, 17% on hand soap. And some WTO members even apply tariffs as high as 65%. So this is a very basic product that is, of course, needed to sanitize. And as a sector, PPE goods, again, hand soap, sanitizer, face masks, protective spectacles, all which are needed in the fight against COVID-19, attract an average tariff of about 11.5%, and it can go higher. It can be as high as 27% in some countries. So when we think about the flow of these products, one important consideration is, can we lower costs? And so therefore, can we lower tariffs? But at the same time, a tariff, even a very high tariff, will not necessarily slow down or prevent a product from entering a market. I think we all know that. And so that brings me to a second key factor. And that, as you have said in your introduction, we need to think about technical regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures. And some non-tariff measures may have an even greater impact on how swiftly goods can enter markets, or even if they can enter at all. And even without a pandemic, suppliers of medical products must often navigate and comply with a diverse range of measures and procedures. And that's in a normal situation. And this can be very daunting, it can be slow, and it can be expensive. Of course, at the same time, we all know that medical products, particularly the more sophisticated ones, but even the less sophisticated ones like face masks, do pose risks, and controls are needed to ensure that substandard products do not enter the market. So there has to be a balance here between facilitating trade or facilitating supply on the one hand, and on the other hand, ensuring that, that the actual quality and safety is actually ensured. All of this certainly becomes even more challenging if every country applies different regulations, different certification procedures for medical goods. And in all of this diversity, if there is no mutual recognition of conformity assessment results, again, this creates another layer of complexity. And all of this to say that, unless we address these issues, it can certainly limit potential sources of supply or slow down the flow of vital medical equipment, or perhaps even completely stop the flow. And as we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, it can be so urgent to actually deciding whether people manage to live or not in the face of a crisis. Of course, everything that I've said so far is not a new challenge. But I think, again, emphasizing the point that it is a challenge that becomes particularly urgent. So how can the WTO rules help as a starting point? Well, for start, TBT, technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, they both promote the use of international standards. And in the best world scenario, harmonization to a single relevant international standard would allow PPE and other essential medical goods to move to where they're most needed and help minimize delays. And of course, with that, it is also an ideal that we ensure that conformity assessment procedures also do not hamper trade. And it becomes easier to check conformity of imported products when they're produced according to the same international standard that is followed domestically. The agreement also encourages recognition, mutual or unilateral, of conformity assessment results from other members to avoid delays. Agreement has transparency, notification obligations to share information about changes in regulations, to avoid disruptions from emergency measures. And of course, the overriding goal of the agreement, like virtually all WTO agreements, is to facilitate trade by avoiding discrimination and unnecessarily trade restrictive measures. That is, as I said, a starting point. I mean, that's what the agreement is there for, and that's what the agreement insists upon, and those are the obligations that we would like our members who have committed to fulfill them to do. Of course, we know that in practice, things are complex, and that governments do need to respond urgently. They do need to take certain measures, and there are flexibilities within the WTO agreements to allow for response in an emergency setting. That being said, transparency remains very key. It's very important during the COVID-19 crisis. And we have seen that our WTO members have continued to submit notifications throughout the period. These have been on both routine regulatory matters, as well as on emergency actions that they have taken to respond to COVID-19. If I zoom in more on TBT and SPS, the majority of all COVID-related notifications from WTO members, about 2/3 of them concern standards and regulations, namely things covered by TBT and SPS. So you can see quite a big concentration on matters that fall under these agreements. What do these notifications do? Around half of them could be considered to be trade facilitating. They are taken as temporary actions, and these notifications mainly affect trade in PPEs, in food, live animals, medical equipment. And what do they suggest where the action is happening? Well, we see 4 broad categories in terms of streamlining certification procedures, ensuring that medical goods are safe, making food available by relaxing technical regulations, and addressing COVID-19 risks from international trade in live animals. Just very quickly, I know other people on the panel will go deeper into this. A few examples of what these things are. For instance, to expedite access to PPE on a temporary basis, Switzerland lifted its certification requirements. Thailand introduced facilitated registration. Canada loosened its bilingual labeling rules. There have been groups of members, I won't go through each of them, have also done things like accepting scanned copies or electronic SPS certificates and so on. So these were some of the trade facilitating measures taken to deal with disruptions caused by COVID-19. At a much more sort of overriding perspective, at the level of the WTO General Council, there was a special meeting of the General Council on 15 May. The General Council is the WTO's highest body. We heard that members discuss different perspectives or dimensions to COVID-19 response and recovery. Very quickly, many recognize that, of course, saving the lives of people is #1 priority. In fact, not many, all, I would say, recognize that. They also recognize that the economic dimensions of the crisis, as it progresses, threatens to compound the already negative effects on livelihoods and health. And in this circumstance, trade, or the lack of it, can contribute to either ameliorating problems or aggravating the challenges, namely the lack of trade, in both immediate and longer term. So looking towards protecting people, there was a strong sense, I would say, that, that markets need to keep open in order to facilitate the flow of essential medical goods. And I would throw into that agricultural and food products, even if though they're not medical per se. Zooming in a little bit more to the TBT committee, the work of the TBT delegations, they've continued working. Just 2 weeks ago, we continued this process of submitting specific trade concerns using a new online platform called e-Agenda. Members discussed 72 specific trade concerns. Incidentally, this is a record for the committee. The high and actually done through a written procedure using this online platform. And I think this suggests to us that, that the mechanisms still remain there and that we can still use these mechanisms, although there are challenges posed by COVID-19. And we have also taken steps to help people better access notifications. Especially those related to COVID-19, we have the EPING alert system. We have a special focus within the EPING alert system to notifications by members that relate to regulatory changes related to COVID-19. Of course, this is a crisis, and as they were notifying or during the discussions, members also point out that they need flexible timeframes to implement or adapt to new measures. My last bit is just to look a little bit more forward and to think in terms of what more can be done in the area of trade, quality, and safety. How can we further streamline regulations, certification requirements? How do we increase access to essential PPE, medical equipment, and so forth? But, and I think here is very important, streamline, facilitate, but at the same time, ensure safety, health, and quality. That cannot be compromised. So some issues for discussion as we go through, strengthening reliance on international standards, where international standards do not exist or where there are multiple competing standards. And when these differences do not necessarily have a substantive impact on performance and safety, could those organizations who establish these standards explore how to improve global alignment? And that's a very real problem. And I think, some reports show that even in the issue of masks or face masks, there are different standards between different regions. And the question becomes, how can we ensure that these differences do not impede flow? Regulatory cooperation, again, a very significant area. Again, I'm sure Celine Kaufman from OECD will speak at length about this, so I won't say much, but just to say that, we in the TBT committee have had discussions on regulatory cooperation in the context of medical devices, and these discussions look at whether greater reliance could be put on existing frameworks like international medical devices regulators or the medical device single audit program. Again, questions about how to reduce duplication, promote more efficient and effective use of resources, faster approvals, and so forth. An area that, of course, could be looked at with more focus, mutual or unilateral recognition of health technology approvals by regulatory authorities. Could we find ways to facilitate that? Could there, for instance, be ways to authorize the importation and use of the product from trusted jurisdictions where regulatory approval has already been given? And very lastly, a very broad subject, but it's, I think, one quite critical, dialogue and cooperation between exporting and importing governments. There needs to be such dialogue, and this dialogue can help facilitate flow of goods and ensure that measures taken do not create unintended obstacles. WTO provides one such forum in the context of the TBT SPS committees, but of course there are others. And many of you here today on the panel play really very important roles, including UNIDO, and your expertise to these questions on ensuring flow, ensuring quality and safety are really key. And so in the face of an unprecedented crisis, we need unprecedented cooperation to keep supply chains working. And I look very much forward to the discussion and the ideas that will come from the panel. So thank you very much, Mr. Davila. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, let's say, introduction to the subject. I can take some of the key points. Tariffs do not necessarily slow down market access, and especially in times of COVID. There is a need for increasing mutual recognition and having recognized and trust from product standards, regulations, and conformity assessment procedures. You mentioned that two-thirds of the notifications related to COVID are related to SPS and TBT. And I guess these notifications we can add, and these measures taken, apart from being timely, targeted, and temporary, we can add another T to that it needs to be transparent. With that, the notifications, before we go to the next presenter, I would like to encourage the audience to see if they know which of the following W2 members have submitted the most COVID-related TBT and SPS notifications. We'll just give some seconds to answer. I think we can share, we have shared the results. The audience, they seem to be more inclined that the European Union is the one who has submitted the most COVID-19 related TBT and SPS notifications. Well, this, to let the audience, the country that has submitted most COVID-19 related TBT and SPS notifications is Brazil. And this brings me to our next speaker, Mr. Augusto Geyer, Deputy General Manager of the Medical Devices Office at the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa. And thank you, and the floor is to you, Augusto. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank, on behalf of Anvisa, for the invitation to participate on this panel. It's an honor for Anvisa and also for me to be involved in this initiative. Well, I have a presentation, so I hope you can see my screen.
We're not able to see the screen. Maybe we can put it on and we just follow your lead or to switch the slides. There it is. I think we're now getting something. It is there now. I can see it. Please go ahead.
So can you put on presentation mode, please? Is that okay? Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. We'll just try to put it in the presentation mode. There it is.
Okay. Well, so this is just a very short overview on what we have been doing at Anvisa during this pandemic. So the perspective of Brazil. So the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency is responsible for the registration and the market authorizations of medical devices for the Brazilian market. And then we have taken some actions to make the medical goods necessary to be front of the pandemic. So I will present what steps has Brazil taken to facilitate access to the essential medical goods through conformity assessment during the pandemic, and also how has Brazil balanced health and safety with the need to speed up access to essential medical goods. So can we come back to the previous slide? Okay, thank you. So this is just a few numbers regarding the pandemic. Now in Brazil, we have almost more than 770,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and almost 40,000 deaths by now, with a lethality of 5.14%. And we have the biggest problems are in the biggest centers, urban centers, as in São Paulo, Rio, and in some cities of the north of the country. So if you look at the graph in your right, we will be able to see that Brazil has reached around 10,000 infections per 100,000 inhabitants after 100 days. And this is the behavior compared to other countries like United States, United Kingdom, Spain, France, Italy, Japan, and China. So looks like Brazil still increasing the curve. So we still have a lot of problems to face in the near future. So next one, please. So on February 4th, was declared the public health emergency of national importance in Brazil. And then now the intention here is to present a timeline of the Anvisa's actions to mitigate the risks of the pandemic in Brazil, especially in the sense of expanding the access to in vitro diagnostic kits, PPEs, and also ventilators. So next one, please. So in this timeline, the first topic, the first action that Anvisa took was RDC 346. We had implement alternatives to GMP certification, which is a requirement for the registration of products. So we started to promote remote inspections for manufacturers, and some other, we started to use more the MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program, to be able to speed up the certification process. Also, in 17 March, we had implemented a fast track for COVID-19 IVD registration. So all COVID-19 IVDs were prioritized from that point on. Then we have on March 19, we have the first approved rapid test kit for COVID-19. Also, we have changes on the procedure deadlines for companies to answer eventual questions from the regulatory agency. And then we also have simplified rules for the essential medical devices to be used during the pandemic. Also, we have put some questions and answers about our DCs, the newer DC available on the website to help the companies that would intend to put products in the market to provide the complete dossier, or at least as much as possible. So on April 8th, we have published a list of the approved COVID-19 IVDs, which is available in our website, and also questions and answers about the COVID-19 tests available on the website. So this is directed for the public in general, not only for the technical experts. In April 23, we have approved the products. We have a list. We have published a list based on Power BI of the products that are waiting for review at Anvisa. So this gives a panel of how many products would be available for the market and for the laboratories to be used during the pandemic. We also had a permission for rapid point-of-care tests in community pharmacies. So by until April 29, we didn't allow the use of rapid point-of-care tests in pharmacies, but to be to allow the population to be tested in the pharmacies, this regulation was issued. Then in 4th of May, we have changes in this RDC 356, bringing detailed procedures for the importation of products. So to make the regulation more clear to the industry on how to import those products. Also, we have implemented a post-market monitoring of the quality of COVID-19 IVDs, which is available in the website, and I will show in the next slides. Next one, please. Okay, so this is just a panorama of how many COVID-19 IVDs we have had received at Anvisa. So by yesterday, we had a total submitted dossiers and a number of 485 dossiers, which is probably the highest number of tests for one specific parameter that we have ever had in Anvisa. Of course, some of those products are the same that are imported by different distributors. And by now, we have approved 179 registration of those products. And we still have 108 dossiers with pending points waiting for the answers of the companies. And we have had 79 refused dossiers with a non-complete or information or refused. Next one, please. So this is a view of the COVID-19 IVD approved products and review queue available on the website. So here the user can see every product that was submitted to Anvisa. So the user, the hospital, the clinician would be able to check if the product is registered within Anvisa and some other characteristics of the product would be available in this Power BI table. And here you can also see how many approved products, how many waiting for review, and the total number of submissions. Next one. So with the aligned with this all these initiatives, we have implemented a post-market monitoring system for COVID-19 IVDs, and also so these tests are performed by the Instituto Nacional de Controle de Qualidade em Saúde, which is a public laboratory in Rio de Janeiro, which is responsible to test, to evaluate the performance of those products. So they are performing tests, assays on these products, and issuing some results on the website. Next one. Also, I would like to emphasize that some initiatives from the private sector. So there is a group of technical associations, technical and scientific associations, which started an evaluation of registered products, registered IVD products. So in this website, you can see the tests that they are performing with those registered products by Anvisa. So this is a very important initiative to give us more chance to identify the products, the quality of the good products that we have in the market. Next one. Then also regarding other products different from IVDs, we have the personal protective equipments and also ventilators. I would say that those are the main medical devices that are involved in this pandemic. And we also have some actions on this regards. So we have a RDC 349, which simplified the rules for the registration or for the market authorizations of PPEs and ventilators. So as mentioned before, we have allowed dossiers without some translations, for example, or without some certifications of products that can be performed later after the register is already issued.
Augusto, one thing, just to keep a bit on the time, please.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry.
Two more minutes.
Okay, thank you. And also we have issued a basic step-by-step for pulmonary ventilators that is available on the website. Next one. So just here we have some other regulations that were issued, changes on the submission of clinical evaluations, specific rules for automatic ambulances. So those are products that were adapted for the use during the pandemic if ventilators are not available. Next one, please. And then regarding the regulatory reliance, we have been using information from IMDRF members to issue the Brazilian authorizations. Next one. Regarding the automatic ambulance, so those would be the minimal requirements that should be presented by the manufacturers. And so this is one important action to have alternatives. Next one. So those are the numbers of products, ventilators and automatic ambulances submitted to Anvisa by now. And next one. And all this information is available in this quarterly report in the context of pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is available online. And I believe this is the next one is the last slide. So just what lessons so far? So we have learned at this point that medical devices regulators must have emergency plans to put in place before, or at least as soon as the emergency starts. So we have identified that we have to have something prepared before any emergency plan. Adoption of standards, international standards, expansion of regulatory reliance, and information exchange between regulators speeds up all solutions. And the crisis always helps to find room for regulation improvement and simplification that we have been doing. Also, post-market monitoring is crucial in times of crisis because opportunities and opportunists are everywhere, every time. And collaboration between public and private sector is essential. So this would be my presentation. Sorry if I have advanced on time in the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto. I think that was a very clear presentation on the steps that Brazil is taking. And of course, we all are learning from this process. I can take 2 points from your presentation just to make the link to our next presenter and to the previous presenter. We were discussing with the presentation of Ho on the balance and the trades-off between facilitating trade, but also ensuring the safety and the quality. And I see the example of Brazil has done some simplification of rules, facilitating trade, but also making sure that the conformity is there and the market surveillance is there. As in these times of crisis, time means lives. In other times, time means money. Time is money. You know that say. But in time of crisis like the COVID, time is lives. And the other example of the regulatory reliance, and this brings me how you are cooperating at this level. And this brings me to my next presenter, Celine Kaufmann. She is the Deputy Head of Regulatory Policy Division at the OECD. So now to you, Celine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pablo, for handing over the floor to me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I want really to thank the UNIDO because it's a very timely undertaking. Also because at 1 p.m. this afternoon, we released the work we were developing on the role of international regulatory cooperation in times of the crisis. So it's really timely for us. That work we developed on regulatory cooperation is actually part of a broader set of responses that we are developing under pandemics, including looking into issues like administrative simplification that were mentioned before, or the role of inspections in time of crisis, or the role of typical regulatory management tools like impact assessment and stakeholder engagement. How can countries that are pressed for time can still use these core good regulatory practices to uphold good regulatory quality? So when it comes to regulatory cooperation, the work we've been doing is a bit broader than the topic of today, but still there is a very strong area that is related to the availability of essential goods, such as health products and protective equipment. And what we've been doing is to focus very much on behind the border regulations in sectors that are actually very heavily regulated, like health. But what I'd like to do is first echoing Director Ho Lim on taking a step back and reminding that actually in normal times, we already know that regulatory differences across countries can impose costs and burdens on traders if those regulatory requirements, regulations actually do not take into account the international environment and if they are developed in isolation. And at the OECD, with our trade colleagues, we've actually defined those costs that were arising from regulatory divergences in three categories. The information cost, which is the cost of gathering the information about the regulatory requirements. The specification cost, which is the cost of specifying products to different regulatory requirements, and what we call the conformity assessment cost, which is the cost of proving that to regulators that you are actually complying with the regulatory requirements. And what we know about those costs is that actually they are really cumbersome for long global value chain, and they are very cumbersome for SMEs in particular. So now, coming back to today's crisis, how is this relevant? Actually, what we've seen in the current crisis is really the multiplication of emergency regulations. A lot of regulatory decisions have been taken all along the responses to the crisis. It has been the main, policy tool for actually framing restrictions, for framing lockdowns, for reorienting productions towards essential goods. And it has had obviously very strong impacts on the movement of people, on the movement of products, on production capacity, on distribution capacity. However, what we've seen as well is given the urgency, the emergency of these procedures, of these regulatory decisions, governments rarely had time to carry out their full diligence in terms of good regulatory practices on these regulatory decisions that they were taking. So in terms of stakeholder engagement or impact assessments, we can see that at best there had been some light procedures that have been carried out. And along these lines as well, we've seen that the initial responses were little coordinated across countries. And to some extent, this is understandable because the responses had to account for different phases of the virus spread and different country conditions, for example. However, these unilateral actions have been sometimes very disruptive and not necessarily effective. So what we've seen, even very early in the crisis, is a multiplication of the calls for coordination across different policy communities, in the trade policy community, in the health policy community, in the G20, among different international organizations, by experts, there has been a multiplication of discourse for coordination. So very concretely, what does it mean to coordinate on regulations, on technical regulations, on technical requirements and on conformity assessment? So this is very much what the paper we've done is about. What have we seen on the ground in terms of regulatory cooperation happening, and what are the lessons learned for the future? And that work actually helped us to understand that when it comes to ensuring availability of essential goods, there are more or less 3 building blocks to coordination. And you won't be surprised because they've been already mentioned by the 2 other speakers before. 2 have to do with core good regulatory practices in the design of regulation, those being transparency and adoption of international standards. And 1 has to do with the expediting, in a way, of administrative processes around conformity assessment. So it's been mentioned before, but when it comes to transparency and information exchange on technical regulations, this is really a sine qua non condition to open the possibility of a dialogue between regulators and between countries, and to work towards more coherent regulations across jurisdictions. So we heard about EPing and the platform that the WTO is providing to actually increase transparency around TBT, around SPS. And there are also other initiatives that have been actually developed during the crisis, notably from WCO in partnership with WTO and others as well, that provided some repositories of temporary export and import measures. And I think the international organizations have shown through that crisis how they can actually act as a hub for information exchange across different regulators, across different countries, and WTO and WCO in that particular examples used this platform to help with more transparency on technical regulations. We can also mention the initiative by the European Commission on transport restriction notification, for example. And beyond, as you can see, beyond providing a critical building block of cooperation across countries, transparency, exchange of information can help as well deal with that information cost for traders, for businesses that I mentioned at the beginning. Beyond transparency, and this is the second aspect of coordination across countries, cooperation to facilitate trade and guarantee a certain level of safety can and has taken different forms, and I want to mention only 2. One is the agreements and the development of a number of lists around the key products that are relevant to fight the COVID-19, the crisis. Lists that have been developed again by WCO and others to actually support trade facilitation in those specific products. But in that landscape of coordination, the adoption and recognition of international standards, I think, as a specific position is a tool that is especially useful because it can provide an anchor points for actually coordinating regulatory approaches. It is very helpful to help address the specification cost that I mentioned earlier, because international standards can support a shared definition of specification requirements, which under crisis, when time is of the essence, can reduce the differences in regulatory requirements, can expedite the administrative processes, and ultimately ramp up production, procurement, and trade. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that. One very interesting trend that we've seen during the crisis, be it within the EU with CEN and CENELEC, but also internationally with ISO and IEC, has been the availability for free of a number of standards that are relevant for fighting the crisis, either in protective equipment, for example, or in medical devices. As a result, because we've seen a number of consequences of that, I can mention 2 in particular. We've seen, for example, the ramp up of production of ventilators in Chile that has actually adopted the ISO standard, ISO IEC standard in relation to that. And it was very much as well as another example the basis for the joint procurement within the EU of medical equipment. So you have here examples of how the adoption and the availability of international standards can actually facilitate production and trade. And then the third point I wanted to mention is related to the conformity assessment, which catalyze usually most of the trade concerns, and where, and we've mentioned that before, recognition approaches can reduce costs by helping to expedite processes when paperwork has already been accomplished in a trusted jurisdiction. I think here the key message from the crisis has been the following. Because it takes time to develop mutual recognition agreements and they were not in place in all jurisdictions, what we've seen on the ground is the multiplication, and that was mentioned as well, of unilateral recognition initiatives in a number of fields and in a number of countries. And that has proved to be a flexible and rapid option, which does obviously not require negotiations. We've seen that in the UK, we've seen that in the US, we've seen that in Canada. And what I think is interesting is that it might pave the way of their further use in the future after the crisis, either as a basis for mutual recognition agreements or as a mechanism in itself that can be tapped on in emergency cases. And this brings me to the conclusion, which is actually, in terms of looking forward, I think the three elements of cooperation, the three building blocks that we've highlighted in the work that we've carried out, illustrate well one key lesson that is emerging from the crisis, that is that regulatory cooperation is actually a very hard work, and it needs to be institutionalized to be mobilized during a crisis. It is, I think it is, regulatory cooperation takes time, and it takes confidence to develop, be it the development, the joint development of international standards in the framework of international organizations, or the agreements on mutual recognition agreements. Those take time, and it's very difficult to develop under a crisis when time is of essence, and time is life, as you were mentioning, Juan Pablo, actually. So a lesson for the future is very much that it needs, regulatory cooperation needs to be built in regulatory system as a critical component of their resilience. And to a large extent, international organizations like the WTO, UNIDO, the OECD provide already countries with this institutional setup to cooperate beyond their own borders on standards, on rulemaking, on a wide range of areas. But as we always say at the OECD and with countries, regulatory cooperation very much starts at home with a strong embedding of these regulatory cooperation principles and culture into domestic rulemaking processes. And this is why actually the OECD countries are working together on a specific guidance that can help them embed more systematically regulatory cooperation in their rulemaking. But we have, as like the other face of the coin, also established a platform of 50 international organizations that are working together to see how they can complement domestic action and regulatory cooperation on effective international rulemaking. I'll stop here and I'll be very happy to answer questions. And obviously there are more details and examples in the paper that I mentioned and that I will share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Celine. I think that was a very dense information that you have shared. I will not repeat the points. We are a bit going behind time. Just to see, we have the link that you shared, and we will be sharing to all panelists. We just shared that, the OECD publication that you mentioned. So it is the link there in the chat. If let's see if the attendees can look, click the link and download the publication. Thank you very much, Celine, again. Now, we have seen the view from the international trade environment. We've seen the examples from the private, from the public regulatory, the example of Brazil. We have seen the perspective from the OECD on international regulatory cooperation that is important in times of crisis most. Now we want to see, and this is the time for Mr. Anupan Kaul from the Confederation of Indian Industries to show us and present us the perspective from the private sector. To you, Mr. Anupan, I think you will be sharing a presentation.
Yeah. Yes, Pablo. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you, UNIDO, for inviting us to this very important webinar, and a very timely one, as has been also mentioned by the other panelists in this times of crisis. And most countries, including India, are still grappling with this situation. So there is a great need for looking at the standards and conformity assessment and issues of technical regulations and cooperation within the country, among agencies, as well as across borders. So I have a presentation, and I will share my screen. Is it visible? Pablo, can you confirm this, please?
Yes, it is visible. Just as we're running a bit late on time.
I understand.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So as we saw for Brazil, India is still having this, we still not hit the peak of the crisis. We started, in fact, quite late, end of March. And in fact, when we just about 500 cases, the Indian government actually implemented a lockdown. And it continued through 4 different phases till the 31st of May. And we are now getting into unlock. Unfortunately for us, the curve is still increasing, and we have a lot of cases going on so far. So, I mean, there is, of course, an estimate that the lockdown has been able to reduce the number of cases to a very large extent. However, we could not really contain the number that we really wanted to, and multiple reasons: social constraints, a large migrant population which has traveled from one part of the country to another, and many other things. But then what it did was it gave the government a lot of time to prepare for the infrastructure to deal with these numbers that we are now witnessing. And also, of course, sorry, I'm just one sec, please. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it also gave time to the government to set up a system for the procurement of the COVID testing kits, the IVDs, and the PPEs, and the medical devices such as ventilators. So, so India has technical regulations on medical devices, but this regulation came only in the year 2017, and many medical devices are still, getting under the coverage of this regulation. So I'll show you the list in the next one, but as far as the standards themselves are concerned, so it gives a priority list. The first priority for conformance to standards is those which are laid down by the National Standards Body, which is the Bureau of Indian Standards. The next, in the next hierarchy is the international standard, and then the manufacturer standard. But I can assure you that since I'm also in the policy committee of the Bureau of Indian Standards, that predominantly most of the standards which have been adopted by the BIS or are being adopted are all ISO or IEC standards, and so there will not be any issue as far as international standards are concerned with this. So at this point of time, if you look at the list of regulated medical devices, we have 23 categories which are currently regulated and which requires regulatory approval. This is harmonized to the global task force, the health task force. That means we have these 4 classes of devices: A, B, and C, and D. C and D are the ones which are directly evaluated by the regulator. And for A and B, they can be evaluated by notified bodies which are accredited by the National Accreditation Board, and who can be both in India and overseas. So as far as conformity assessment for A and B class of devices is concerned, will not be an issue right now or even in the future. But for the others, the regulator himself will be evaluating the devices, both for Indian as well as for others. And we have another list of devices coming up in the year one of them, of course, this year, the ultrasound equipment this year. And all of those, and most of them are diagnostic equipment coming up for regulation next year. Of course, as far as the, so one more regulation which is coming up is that for these devices which are not regulated so far, there would be a requirement for registration of the medical devices. And this will be applicable from next year, 30th September. And the requirement for this is that the suppliers must conform to ISO 13485, which is the management system standard for medical device producers. So as far as the PPE is concerned, this will fall in this category of products. Only an advisory has been issued. Right now it's under voluntary registration, not mandatory, but advisory has been issued to all the PPE suppliers to register themselves under this, this requirement. So as far as the IVDs are concerned, the COVID testing kits are concerned, the regulator actually approved them. Very similar to what Brazil told us. We have a total of 105 suppliers who have been registered. As we can see over here, only 12 of them are indigenous from India, and 93 are from different countries, including of course Europe, China, USA, and Latin American countries and Asian countries. And similarly for the antibody test kits and for the antigen test kits also, we have 108 suppliers, out of which most of them are overseas. The requirement for their validation or approval is essentially similar to what other countries are following, but one concession has been given for those suppliers who have US FDA approval. No further validation is required, but for all others, including those who conform to the CE IVD of European directive, and all non-US FDA approved or indigenous kits, all of them will require validation, for which 24 centers have been notified by the Indian Council for Medical Research. And not only approval, but it will also require batch testing certificate when the supplies are later on happening. So this is in right now, it's already being used in India, all of these kits by the testing laboratories. So some of the steps that the regulator has taken, he has been extremely proactive in this. So all the approvals for these kits was under very special dispensation, was done in 7 days time, within 7 days time for all manufacturers, and based on recommendations made by the CII and many other industry bodies. So many of the requirements for documentation, the legal documents, the notarization documents, many of them have been waived off, particularly for these COVID-related IVDs and other equipment. And even for all other medical devices, the regulator has been working hard, and most of the approvals are now granted within less than 20 days. Of course, the regulatory decisions have also included a lot of cancellation of licenses in order to ensure the quality of the medical devices and the IVDs. So as far as the quality requirements for the PPE is concerned, so the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India, that's the organization, that's the ministry which has taken charge. So they have issued very detailed guidelines, and two important things that I wanted to highlight was, so the first part is they have identified what you see on the right hand side. These are the PPEs very clearly identified. And on the left hand side, you see how the different types of PPEs, for example, masks N95 or triple layer. So at the airport, and at the airport also specific desks, health desks or immigration counters, which specific PPEs they should be wearing. All that has been listed for hospitals, both for outpatient and inpatient settings, emergency stations, ambulances, supporting ancillary services, health workers. So this has created a very clear understanding among people what type of devices they need to procure for each different roles at these different occupations. And then these are the standards which have been adopted by the Ministry of Health. Please note that India did not really have too many standards on this, even though we have a very old standards body in India, which has been doing a lot of standards work, including medical devices and hospital equipment. But specifically for these devices, most of the standards are not available except for the masks, which you see at the bottom, triple layer and surgical masks, we have Indian standard, and they're also under certification. But for all others, we have adopted either ASTM or ANSI or European standards for gloves, coveralls, goggles, so on and so forth. But especially for coveralls, which is the major PPE that is being procured right now, because India was not producing PPEs at all of the type that is required, except for surgical gowns for hospitals. So there has been a relaxation from meeting the full requirement for ISO 16603, and only the blood permeability test with viral load, which is applicable for class 3 equipment, and seam joints, which is the most other vital requirement. Only these are required right now to be conformed and to be tested by the approved laboratories. Of course, the BIS, the Bureau of Indian Standards, is right now under process of developing a simplified standard for the coveralls or the PPE, the body suits, that means, for specific COVID-related uses. And all the items that are to be supplied, they need to be accompanied with certificate of analysis from national or international organizations and laboratories indicating conformity to standards. So this does not actually present any trade embargo or any market access issue because of standards or technical regulations at this point of time. For certification of coveralls, this has been the major work that India has been doing. As I mentioned, they are not being manufactured in India, and therefore the Indian industry was actually requested to start production. The CII played a very important role. I'll show you slides later on. we collated the anticipated demand for the coverall, and then requested our own industry members and manufacturers, particularly those into textile sector, to start manufacturing coveralls. And within, as we see, within 2 months' time, we have as many as 700 manufacturers who have developed capability to produce the coveralls and registered their samples. Currently, we are producing 300,000 pieces per day, but the demand is going to be 30 million pieces as per current estimates, and this may even go up. 9 laboratories have been identified who are testing the PPEs, and no imports or exports are currently happening in coveralls. I think all countries right now are looking after their own domestic markets. So this is at this point of time not happening, but if it is required, it is possible to import coveralls from other countries. So this is the kind of certificate which is being issued. Every manufacturer is given a unique certification code, and he can use this certificate for making supplies to the state governments or to central agencies, to hospitals, anywhere after the type approval. And a system for batch inspection has also been set up. So CII, of course, I mean, as has been introduced, we are the largest industry body in India, and we work very closely with the government. Essentially, we advocate industry interest, but we also have a very, very holistic and very wide social agenda to promote equitable, distribution of interests. So what we did in this crisis was we formed a coalition of manufacturers for augmenting the inventory of ventilators and the PPE, both through the indigenous manufacturers and also by importing them. And some of them from the non-healthcare companies. That means for ventilators, many of the automobile manufacturers, they came forward to develop. Some of the defense establishments came forward to develop ventilators. And also PPEs, as I mentioned to you, most of the garment and apparel manufacturers came forward to manufacture PPE. We also reached out to various member private hospitals who are our members on the various essential items that they require for critical care, and collated the demand. And this is being shared with the manufacturer both in India as well as abroad. We also collated a list of the essential items that we required with manufacturing details to facilitate a direct connect between buyers and the manufacturers of this item for very quick procurement. I'll show you the next slide. And we also,
sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
We will need to put some conclusion.
Just 1 minute. 1 minute, Pablo. So this is the website that we have created.
Yes,
it gives us the suppliers and the demand side for the critical items. These are the numbers. They are suppliers. This is on the CII website that we have created, and we also created the CII helpline, and also collated the global advisories on healthcare issued by different countries, which will facilitate our manufacturers to look at their concerns. So the primary concern. This is my last slide, please. One of them is that the ISO/IEC standard for ventilators we have found are currently too cumbersome, and it is not possible for countries which have not done any manufacturing to start using them. So we saw that some of the countries like the UK have issued COVID-specific ventilator standards, and therefore the BIS in India is also trying to develop one, but we recommend that for such situations, there should be a uniform standard which can be quickly developed at the ISO or IC level and which can be made use for most of the countries. We've also witnessed a lot of fake certificates in the market for CE and FDA by both in India and overseas. And the procurement agencies are just not aware how they can distinguish between fake and original certificates. So we are trying to help them to identify the fake and the non-fake ones. Another issue that we have faced is because there's so many agencies in India, that the Ministry of Textiles, Health, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and then bodies like this, the CDCs and the Indian Council of Medical Research. Many of them have got into the act, but there's a little issue of coordination among the agencies. And the last one is that we are facing some difficulty in getting COVID testing results, which are turning out to be false negative, and some are also turning out to be false positive. So we are taking some steps for monitoring the test protocols. In fact, today there was a board meeting of the National Accreditation Board for Laboratories. We have raised the issue. So we will set up a monitoring program for interlab comparison and look at whether we can resolve this issue. That's my presentation. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you, Anupan. Without further comments, because our participant, next panelist is in a tight schedule, I will leave the floor to Dr. Bernardo Calzadilla.
Yeah, good afternoon. Please close the other presentation so that I can share some slides. Anupam?
It's closed. You can share your slide.
Yeah, I have closed it, Dr. Bernardo.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to Augusto. to Ike and to Celine and to Anupam. Thank you very much. Very rich presentations. I have really enjoyed the technical details, and this allows me not to be so detailed in what I'm going to say, but rather to speak a bit, how did we see from UNIDO side, the response? And there is no doubt that we started this with a crisis of trust, with a crisis of confidence. But the first news in relation linking the health crisis with economy was about trade, is when we heard that there are export restrictions, there are all these problems related to substandards, to how the PPEs are being handled, how the scarcity, how the supply chain disruption has brought about a problem of enough supply in a world that suddenly exploded the demand. And we had a problem of disconnect of all this. So I will share a bit how did we react from UNIDO. The first thing is to say what can we do and how does our area, technical area, help to respond to COVID. And certainly our framework, the SDG, we looked at the SDGs and said, okay, how is this affecting people, planet, and prosperity? And we have seen that at the core certainly was the people. SDG 3, it was about tested, it was about reliable results, it was about quality control and product testing, it was about laboratories and how they are performing, but also it was about much more simple things, hygiene practices, food safety standards. And at the beginning, at the core of the link to the economic crisis was the disruption of the value chain. Linking up to planet, very shortly we have seen an improvement of the situation, especially in big cities, but also there we have seen a lot of medical waste coming, so this has also increased. And we saw that trade is very important to to ensure the availability and affordability, because it's about affordability of vital medicines, medical products, and protective gears, but also that it is necessary to have mutual recognition, because mutual recognition of accredited test result builds the confidence. And we started with a crisis immediately of confidence. We started with some ideas that protectionism is coming back from groups of countries that were not. Sure, we have heard that many countries try to make the picture a bit more rosy by saying, no, we are liberating the standards, etc. But damage was done. It started by export restriction, and this was a very strong message to the international community and a worrying process, because protectionism sounded in the air. But looking from UNIDO, and I remember, and I have it still present, Mr. Pascal Lamy, former WTO DG, has always said, well, with UNIDO there is a complementarity. We have trade on the one side, but the other side of the coin is productive capacity building, industrial development. And that's the focus of what we do, SDG 9. And in SDG 9, we have seen standards, quality infrastructure, be it measurement, accreditation, be it certification, conformity assessment in general, are fundamental aspects that help the development. And we had already seen that there are a number of standards, international standards, such as business continuity, risk management, resilience, and so forth, that can help us to deal with the subject. So this is the overall picture. So I would rather like to share what we have been doing. I will not get into the quality infrastructure. This picture is there just to reiterate the relevance of quality infrastructure services, of conformity assessment, and the need to link all with the consumer as well. We have, first of all, very happy to say we have been working for so many years on conformity assessment. We have now released the guidance on implementing 17025, which is a very known standard for the competence of laboratories, which is at the core. And we had recently, 2 days ago, Accreditation Day, and this is at the core. Accreditation is so important to build confidence and to build standards. But in UNIDO, we have started with a strategy of containing first, adapting, and then recovering. And at the beginning, the first action we took is we needed to forge dialogue, because it was said the moment is a moment of required coordination. And one way to coordinate the development of standard is nothing else than the business of doing consensus. It's consensus building, and consensus building is collaborating, is having dialogue. So we have started a dialogue with our key partners, which is among others the WTO, ISO, IEC, ITU, ILAC, IF, you name it. So we started a dialogue with a number of partners to see what's going on. We have looked also in another webinar on what is happening to PPE standards and the problems that this is bringing, a lot of problems in relation to gender, how women are being accepted. So we have been working on a number of issues, and how UNIDO has been responding, because what is important, and I have said, we have to look also at productive capacity building, because economy is fundamental for the recovery, but economy is part also of the disruptive moment. So we have been helping in Tajikistan, in Armenia, SMEs to diversify into PPE production. So the link there. And one of the other things, we have been helping several standardization bodies, either by translating, bringing all these standards that suddenly became available to them, adopting them, making small standards for even domestic production of masks, etc. We worked on a resilience roadmap for value chain in Ghana, and through our knowledge hub, we have been really working on the dissemination of knowledge, and the momentum has shown us it is the momentum of digital work, but digitalization and digital space means cybersecurity, and means also that we need to have accessibility and affordability of digital access for everybody, and this is something that is still very concerning. So we move in a moment where, from the message and looking a bit from the UNIDO point of view, we need to start thematizing, we need to start discussing the recovery, industrial recovery, not only with one focus, which was at the core at the beginning, the PPE standards quality discussion, but now we really need to make sure how we can help the companies to rebuild, to get back to fit. We have been setting up several programs. The one is mentioned here is a program from Japan to help to bring technologies related to COVID to the countries and transfer the technology from Japan. We have been working with all our partners, and this is a moment of partnership. It is a moment of collaboration. It is a moment of connectivity. It is important to see also that the regions have a lot to say at this stage. I have mentioned our international partners, WHO, certainly a key partner at this stage, INET-QI, where all the QI institutions are together, ISO. We have also the Global Manufacturing Industrialization Summit that brings me to another momentum, which is looking a bit into the fourth industrial revolution, what comes next, and WTO, our long-term partner in relation to trade and productive capacity building. Always a thank to the partnership we have, especially with the EU, with Japan, with NORAD, with Switzerland. I don't want to forget anybody. There would be many, but it is important to mention that we are partnering with them. But we were in a momentum of technological transformation, and this disruption that we had through COVID has shown us that the digital transformation moment has been strengthened. We will have to do much more in this regard, and there is a unique opportunity to move into the future with a new vision of introducing more these technologies in quality infrastructure. We are talking about metrology 4.0 because we are seeing more and more smart sensors, 3D scanning, mobile tools, etc., being integrated in measurement, smart laboratories, using artificial intelligence, big data, cloud computing, you name it. And this is what is going to also help us in many ways, and I don't have time to elaborate on the examples we have, how drones, sensors, automated cars have been used also in the hospitals to help during this crisis. But I think these elements that we have even seen continuity during the crisis are here to stay, will be part of what has been called the new normal. And in this regard, COVID has, let's say, given a new catalytic push to the technological acceleration in which we were. We need to integrate better in the in this digital age, but we also need to think very much about the sustainability. So we think that in UNIDO, it is the moment where we need to take advantage of this change momentum, of this disruption, to look at how can we better serve the needs of the people that relate with having a safer planet and work towards a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernardo. That was very interesting, the presentation about UNIDO, and you touched on a very important area, which is new technologies. Hoy mentioned the new platforms that WTO has. We see all that this new platform, we're exchanging knowledge, we're reaching places that we were not possible to reach before. Having said that, it is already 3:30. We have reached the planned end of our webinar.
If you would like to continue, I have to apologize. It's something very important, but please go ahead. It would be good you discuss a bit with the audience. Thank you. I will have to leave. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bernardo. We understand that you need to leave. For the panelists, we will just shorten the Q&A session for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, if your time allows. I know we have been very good. We have been listening to very good presentations, very good, interesting themes. One of the things that I want to ask you first, if you have any questions between yourselves that you want to pose, or I can go to the different questions from the audience. So I'll continue, and I think one key area that we have been discussing about trust and how we can rebuild trust and trust of processes, trust of products. It is more essential and indispensable in times of a crisis such as COVID. The mutual recognition, it was mentioned that it's not a new topic. The TBT agreement works on mutual recognition, technical regulations, standards, conformity assessment. It was mentioned by Ho. We have seen some of the lessons learned from the different angles. And one key question, and I think it's for all participants or whoever wants to answer, is considering the good lessons, because we have seen some good lessons that Celine mentioned. You have a multiplication for coordination. Maybe we work better under pressure than if were not under pressure as human beings. The question is, are we going to bounce back to the normal that we had in these areas, in your areas, or are we going to bounce forward? Are we going to once this is over, we turn the page on COVID, are we going to bounce back, not to the new normal as it, but as this cooperation, this somehow, if you want to call it protectionism, this not interesting of unilateral recognitions. Are we going to bounce back, or are we going to bounce forward? And I leave that whoever wants to answer. Ho?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that's a very important question, and I think we have to. I don't think there's a choice. I think we have to bounce back better, and to bounce back better, we have to cooperate more. So I don't think there is a sort of a question that can be answered in the other way. However, I don't think bouncing back better and getting more cooperation is going to be automatic. Because as I think Bernardo was saying, the pressure to go the other way, to close borders, to go to reshoring, to move away from global supply chains or value chains is also a big factor here. And I think in order to bounce back better and to improve cooperation going forward, we need to prove that global value chains are indeed resilient, because I think that is going to be one of the big issues. And I think everyone gathered here in the audience and on the panel all have a role to play in showing that regulatory cooperation in the different forms, and I use regulatory cooperation here in a very wide sense, not limited to only one instrument, is really needed. Most countries, if not all countries, cannot be self-sufficient. Trade has always played a key role in addressing moving things from surplus to deficits and in ensuring that populations have adequate supply. And that was going to be required even more in the future. But again, to stress that all of this is not automatic. It will require everyone to really advocate. I think I can't think of another word, but really to advocate for that and to demonstrate that it can work. That's my 2 cents worth anyway.
Thank you very much. I'll take some questions from the audience. Do the panelists observe any trend of greater use of Internet of Things for medical devices that improve productivity and reduce physical contact during the time of COVID-19? Have you observed any trend of greater use of Internet of Things or new technologies for medical devices? Whoever wants to answer.
So I'll answer that, Pablo, but in a very general sense, that because we have a lot of telemedicine going on right now in different countries, including in India, and some of them are actually related to connectivity of the equipment when we conduct the test, for example, some of the CT scans or MRIs and things like those. So there is a greater use of Internet of Things among devices, and so that's, and it's actually going to go forward because many countries we have limitations of access to medical facilities. So I think that's bound to happen. It's already happening in many ways. Thank you.
On this, and maybe more focus on regulatory cooperation, we know the new technologies are new, and sometimes regulation falls behind the development of the regulations and cooperation. How can regulatory cooperation facilitate the greater use or the usage of these new technologies? Of course, from the angle of the COVID, but I guess this is a more general question, and how can regulatory cooperation facilitate the use of new technologies? And I think, I don't know, Celine, you have an opinion? Thank you.
Maybe on this question of new technologies, a couple of points. The first one is, you asked as your first question whether we were going to bounce back to the beginning or to actually go forward. And I think beyond the crisis, that was a very substantial one. I think we have mega trends such as, you know, the pace of technological change and the explosive news of new technologies of digitalization that will make it very difficult to continue regulating very much in isolation. Because beyond this crisis, new technologies and digitalization have really shown that borders are sometimes an illusion, and that if regulators don't work more together, it's going to be very difficult to actually regulate, frame the use of these new technologies, or actually some of the related issues of, data privacy and so on. So I think that that's a strong megatrend that advocates very strongly for more regulatory cooperation going forward. What we've seen in the crisis, and not really in terms of Internet of Things, but more broadly in terms of the use of new technologies, is the fact that regulators have been considering how they can use new technologies to expand their regulatory capacities. So you followed all the debates about, the tracing of the virus and of information about the virus. There has been a number of debates in a number of countries, including in mine. And it's part of a broader discussion of how new technologies actually can be used by regulators to actually get more information from the ground, to expand their knowledge base, and to actually have regulatory responses that are a bit more flexible and a bit more responsive to the issues at stake. So definitely this is completely redefining, in our view, the way regulators, and in the view of the regulators we work with, the way that we work in the future. And not only because they're actually, as you were mentioning, probably always late in terms of regulating these technologies, but also because these technologies are bringing potentially a lot to regulators to regulate better and to foster regulatory cooperation.
Thank you, Celine. Indeed, new technologies are affecting every aspect of life, quality infrastructure as well. There are new ways of doing inspections, virtual inspections, new ways of collaborating on standards formulation and standards adoption and standard dissemination. I think it's an area that is affecting every area, and as far we would need to look at how can we profit from these new technologies. And how can we standardize the use of, in a way, standardize the products or the new technologies? This question is for Mr. Ho Lim. You highlight that many countries are unilaterally lifting or reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers on medicines needed to counter COVID-19. Is there any effort done by the WTO to encourage countries to do so?
Yes, thank you. Maybe before I get into that question, just a very quick comment on new technologies, because I think it's a very important area, and it's one which the WTO is also, in a way addressing it in several different ways. I mean, one is through the TBT agreement, not specifically to new technologies, but just to recall, we have these 6 principles for international standards development. And so when you think about new technologies, and as standards are being developed for new technologies, one of the key things in these 6 principles is to ensure interoperability, interconnectivity. It's to ensure that there is inclusiveness, for instance, in standards development. Developing countries are not left out in a sense. So I think these principles still remain important, whether you're talking about new technologies or old technologies, possibly even more important for new technologies. Other aspects of WTO, just to mention, there is a very active negotiation going on e-commerce. All of us have experienced e-commerce in all sorts of different ways, and possibly even more so with COVID-19. A lot of e-commerce is dependent on new technologies, so there's a very strong relationship here. And maybe to address this last question on the WTO's work, more specifically on tariffs, the WTO Director General, together with the WHO, with the FAO, have consistently been making the point that we need to try to find ways to facilitate trade. And facilitating trade does include addressing tariffs. And just to clarify a point that I made in the beginning, I wasn't saying that tariffs was not important. I was just simply saying that if you look at tariffs and you will look at non-tariff measures, the way that they impact trade is different. Tariffs make trade more costly, but they do not prevent the product from necessarily entering the market. A non-tariff measure could potentially just block access completely. So these are two different types of impacts, but certainly equally important to address the tariff issue. That being said, it's up to each WTO member government to decide its own tariff structure and what it wishes to either remove or not remove. That's why I mentioned the unilateral dimension to this. There is one agreement in the WTO, the Information Technology Agreement, again, not specifically on medical devices, but there are quite a number of medical devices that do appear on the Information Technology Agreement. And the Information Technology Agreement is about eliminating tariffs, essentially, for those countries that join it. And just to mention, some of these products are critical to combating COVID-19. I just got some information here. Pulse oximeters, which are for measuring your oxygen level or oxygen saturation. That's critical to COVID-19. And that's actually part as well in the Information Technology Agreement. There are other such devices. So there are avenues here that people can think of. There's also an existing pharmaceuticals agreement, not well known. It's a small plurilateral agreement in the WTO. It's more about medicines, it's not about medical devices as such. But they also have lists of medicines and about removal of tariffs on them. So it's not one answer, it's many different answers in many different pockets to that last point. Thank you.
Thank you, very much for the response. Augusto, the experience in Brazil on medical waste equipment, what is the medical waste equipment and your experience in conformity assessment in Brazil?
So actually, the importation of used medical equipments used to be prohibited for Brazil, and we have a very big concern to receive medical waste, medical equipment waste in Brazil. So in the recent, a few weeks ago, we have a regulation to allow the importation of used medical devices, but this is limited only for this period of the pandemic. So there is no intention to have a definitive regulation to allow imported used medical devices. Regarding the waste itself on the services, we have a regulation on that, and all the services, the medical services, are obliged to follow some specific rules on that. And we understand that this is being well regulated by Anvisa and also by the municipalities and states.
Thank you, Augusto. With this, we arrive to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much from UNIDO on your cooperation. I will just want to thank, before giving the floor to my colleague Dorina, thank again the distinguished speakers, the audience, and the team on the back end who has managing the logistics, Nora. A special thanks to Devin McDaniels from the WTO for supporting the design and execution of this webinar. And now I leave the floor to my colleague Dorina. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, and thank you very much to the distinguished panelists. The discussion was very interesting to follow, very rich, very good conclusions. And at this point, I would also like to thank all the attendees that are following us silently, but patiently and very interested from the other side. Thank you everyone for having been here with us today. I would like to remind everybody that we will make the recordings available after the webinar. For any information on this webinar or upcoming webinars in the near future, please refer to our Knowledge Hub under tii.unido.org. And having said that, I would like to one more time congratulate and thank everybody and officially close the webinar with a virtual round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much.